Elman. I'm the Professional Learning and Development Manager at Cambridge University Press. And we are going to be here for the next 45 minutes as Niall tells us about speaking skills and speaking to the screen. Just to introduce Niall briefly, he's a lecturer at the University of Coventry and a researcher in academic writing, corpus linguistics, and language teaching pedagogy. Niall's here. We just need him to turn on his camera and microphone. Hello, Niall.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep, perfect.
Great.
So looking forward to the session. I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And thank you everybody for coming along to my talk this afternoon. And yes, it's really great to have the opportunity to speak at this Cambridge at Home experience and kind of close off this what has been 3 days of really, really fantastic talks. So my presentation for this afternoon is entitled Speaking to the Screen. And so really what I wanted to do with this talk is I wanted to focus on some of the challenges that we may face in general when developing conversation skills, and then think about how maybe they've been amplified in this current context of developing conversation skills in virtual contexts. I talk about speaking to the screen, but you'll notice I'm talking about developing conversation skills. And I really want to kind of set this apart in thinking about not just developing speaking skills, but developing conversation skills that allow us to work with areas of discourse and kind of more complex ways of communicating that can facilitate learning and consolidate learning. So what is my talk about? So for the next 45 minutes, what I'd like to do is try to merge some theory and research from disparate but connected fields of applied linguistics in order to give some indication about how we might be able to use research from these fields in order to inform our practices. And so with that, what I'm talking about is looking at language and conversational language in terms of corpus linguistics and conversation analysis, but also thinking about areas of language pedagogy and psycholinguistics in terms of how we teach and how we engage and sustain motivation for our learners in the development of these kind of conversation and communication skills. And then what I want to do is try and filter all of that through the current context and thinking about how can we apply this in a digital classroom? How do we bring conversation skills to digital classrooms? So within this talk, what we're talking about is a need broadly for communication skills. And when we think about communication skills, that encompasses quite a lot of information. So we're talking about a need to address speaking challenges. And if we look at the kind of challenges that students face in terms of learning a second language and using that second language, time and again, we see that speaking is the area that they often feel least confident about, or perhaps least equipped for. And they often report, while they use language in class effectively, when they go out into the real world, they feel like they're not necessarily able to communicate as well. And so this can be something of a challenge for them to overcome. We can also think about effective communication as well. And so this kind of belies not just thinking about what to say, but why we're saying it, and thinking about language in terms of its functional purpose. So when we're speaking, what are we trying to achieve with this language? What are we trying to do? And then how are we getting to that end? How are we making that happen in terms of authentic communication? We might also think about language in spoken contexts in terms of specific registers. So getting us to think about language in a bit more of a nuanced way. So with this, what I'm saying is we might think about the language of conversation. We might think about the language of radio broadcasts, of political speeches. We might think about the language of any other kind of spoken context, interviews, etc., and try to kind of see this language as unique to its own context in that way. And so this might help us isolate certain ways of speaking and certain practices in speaking that will help students engage in conversations. And so this means not only looking at language, but also thinking about conversation management, right? How do they manage these conversations when they're having them? What kind of skills do they need, and how does that relate to language when we're developing these kind of communication skills? And also we want to think about things like engaged communication. So we're not thinking about developing speaking skills in order for students to be able to demonstrate their ability to speak using particular linguistic features, But instead, what we're talking about is developing interlocutors, right? We're developing people who can actively listen to the people with whom they're speaking and demonstrate that listenership, and then know when they can jump in and be the speaker themselves. And so when we think about the need for communication skills, I think this is reflected in the kinds of kind of graduate attributes that we see coming out from employers, for example, wanting to make sure that people know how to communicate effectively, and this kind of register specific focus, where it's important that we understand things like formality and that we can move in between these different contexts, the difference between a conversation, for example, and this presentation, and how people would speak differently in different contexts. So what can we say about the language of conversation? Quite a lot, actually. So I won't be able to spend too long talking through, but I can give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of this kind of language of conversation. So what do conversations sound like, and why is that important? Well, conversations are typically categorized around kind of action sequences. And by that, what we mean is conversations serve a purpose, right? So we have a conversation in order to do something, in order to achieve some kind of end. Maybe we want to convince somebody of something. Maybe we want to try and understand something. Maybe we want to get somebody's opinion on something. But we have a reason for having a conversation. I mean, even things like small talk has a purpose, right? Where we might want to kind of create a relationship with the people with whom we're speaking. But it has a purpose. And this is different to being able to demonstrate linguistic competence, right? So it's not, we're having a conversation in order to show that I can use the present perfect. It's I'm having a conversation to do something purposefully. And also it's co-constructed. So a conversation can't really be had by one person. We co-construct for conversations with somebody else when we speak to them. So nobody is in charge of the conversation at all times. We move backwards and forwards. And so we have different turns taking place and different ways of managing that as we move through it. I'm working on a project at the moment with a friend and colleague, Geraldine Mark, where we're looking at some traits of contemporary conversations, looking in the British English context. And we're seeing things like yes/no questions are rarely answered with a yes or no. So for example, you don't really respond to a yes/no question with yes or no. You might say something like, well, maybe, I don't know. We see lots of formulaic language like these I don't knows, which allow you to kind of hedge something, create some hesitations or pause a little bit in order to give you some time to speak. Because remembering that conversations are spontaneous, so there's not really a script or a path for us. We're not sure where this is going. And so sometimes we need a moment to try and think. We also have things like response tokens. So this is how we can signal to the person who's speaking that we're listening and perhaps showing kind of agreement. So if I'm speaking, you might be saying like, yes, yes, right. Or maybe just some sounds like, aha, or hmm. So this kind of shows that we're listening, that we're engaged. In conversations, what we tend to have is a series of turns taking place. And at the beginnings and ends of those turns, we often have language that helps us control those. So we might have turn openers and turn closers, and we have different language that we use in order to repair breakdowns in communication, in order to try and keep things going. And so there's quite a lot of information encoded in a conversation that's not just the content. And this is a lot of what helps us create these kind of wider discourses. And so you might be wondering, okay, so this is quite interesting. Perhaps we're looking at the language of conversations and how conversations work. And you might be wondering, why is this relevant to language teaching? Why is this relevant to ELT and TESOL contexts? So we could think about these conversations in terms of discrete little examples, for examples, and we could bring these into the likes of listening scripts or dialogues. And this is an example taken from Donald Carroll. He's a lecturer in Japan, and he works in this area of second language acquisition, second language pedagogy, and conversation analysis. And he talks about this idea of using mini logs as ways to capture what's happening in conversations and be able to signal some of these individual features. And we can see, for example, are you hungry? From Anthony, and then Anna responds, hungry, ? I'm starving. So here actually there was a yes/no question that was answered with a question and then some kind of statement. We don't really get a yes or no. And so this is a good example of how we can kind of identify some of these features and maybe bring these into the likes of listening scripts or dialogues that we have. And when we want to bring this into the kind of wider teaching of ELT, we might think about how this has a pedagogical value as well. Littleton and Mercer talk about this idea of interthinking and co-construction. This is, I think, a really fascinating area of pedagogy more generally, which centers on this socio-cultural idea of learning, that learning is generally a social act, that through kind of communities that we engage with, learning communities, like for example, in a digital or face-to-face classroom, we can learn from one another. But also we learn together. So we actually co-construct the information that we're coming to understand. And so conversations are a perfect example of a space in which we can co-construct something. And we can use conversations not only as a means to get students to practice speaking, but also as a means for students to learn something. So for example, their task could be in some way coming up with a solution for a particular grammatical problem or for particular language items, and getting them to use conversations to be able to figure out what's going on in different contexts. For example, coming up with a rule, a grammar rule. The whole premise here is kind of based on this Vygotskian idea of sociocultural thinking and learning rather, and thinking that we learn in social groupings. And so conversations allow us to do that together, actively, and in a collaborative kind of way. Also, conversation skills reflect both speaking and listening skills. So in kind of focusing more on conversation in lieu of speaking, then what we can do is we can incorporate this kind of development of active listening skills and see them not as two separate or discrete sets of skills, but actually skills that work really strongly together. Also, there is this focus on discourse practices. So we stop really thinking about how to display a particular grammatical competence, how to show that we know present perfect, how to show that we know the past perfect. And we moved to actually thinking about using language for a communicative end. So we're trying to do something with language. And by that do something, effectively what that is create something, create some understanding, create some knowledge, create something that we can share. And so if we kind of take a moment to just reflect on that for a second, what we have at this stage is we've identified that there are different kind of linguistic practices in conversations that are worth identifying. And these help us manage conversations, but also help us organize the language that we're going to use. Conversations then allow us to be able to bring information together, co-construct information, and then use that as a way to not only practice speaking, but learn about speaking and learn about other things too. And so if we see a value in adopting this kind of interthinking approach and bringing conversations into our classrooms in this kind of co-constructed way, then what we can do is we can reflect on what we already know from developing second language conversation skills. And what I've tried to do in general in this presentation, where possible, is I've tried to refer to research that's maybe more freely available and that is designed in some ways for people teaching in the field. So in my references list at the end, you'll be able to get access to all of these papers, some of which are not unfortunately freely available, but for the most part they are. So what can we say about developing second language conversation skills? So in a paper by Philip Kerr, he talked about this idea of making time for speaking and looking at how we, as a kind of a contextual factor, need to consider how we can embed teaching speaking or developing speaking into our curricula, into our classes. And I think while this paper is fascinating, there's lots of really interesting insights. I think one of the key things to take away is that you don't necessarily need to think of speaking just as time for practice and consolidation, but this same idea of speaking as an opportunity for learning and for actively learning through kind of this socio-cultural perspective. So we need to think about how we fit speaking into our program and that we give it the space and time that it needs in order for this valuable learning to take place. And if we see speaking as not just practice time, where we give it a few minutes to it at the end of a task, so that way they can practice language, and we see speaking more as learning time, then we can make more of a priority of speaking in our classes. So this might do things where we want to focus on specific language skills or language items, but also discourse items and strategies. So we're kind of working at both levels. Looking at repetition and thinking back at Scott Thornbury's talk earlier and the idea of repeating tasks in order to kind of foster this kind of development in learners. So looking back at that again and allowing for repetition. And engaging in some perhaps more cognitive approaches like reflection on learning, and we'll talk a little bit about reflection in a little bit. But overall, the idea being that we can then reflect with our learners and develop, include speaking in our curricula in order to develop speaking. Looking at where, talking about learner-centered content, this is all really about thinking about how we personalize the learning. And this sounds often quite complex, how do we personalize? And I'm not talking about creating a personalized interface that streams and gives you the exact content that you need at this exact moment. Rather, what I mean is creating content that's for your learners and that reflects something from your learners, so it feels like it's about them or for them. And what this really means is about putting your learner at the center. And this can be done in quite simple ways. In my own teaching, quite regularly, what I would do, for example, if I'm teaching critical thinking skills, I get students to use Menti and to write their definitions of critical thinking skills. What do they understand critical thinking skills to mean? And then I can actually use their definitions of critical thinking skills as my base for my lesson. And from that point on, then they're actually quite invested, because I'm not just talking about definitions that I've taken from elsewhere and that I've written myself. I'm talking about their understandings, and I'm trying to get them to push those understandings a little bit further. And creating this kind of learner-centered content allows for greater engagement in that sense, and more motivated students. And so this learner-centered idea in terms of getting students to speak, develop conversation skills is quite critical. I think immersion is probably something that we're all quite familiar with. This idea of wanting to create immersive opportunities for language learning. Obviously, I think in the kind of annals of language pedagogy, we know that immersion is really well founded, but it can be quite difficult to emulate. How can we completely create this immersive environment? In some ways, the internet is a great opportunity for this, because the internet is quite immersive. You can really get lost in the content of the internet, but it brings with it a whole lot of other problems in terms of data protection and in terms of safety, depending on your own contexts. In some ways, perhaps creating immersive tasks is more about replicating the kind of real world contexts or feelings around those real world contexts in order to make them a bit higher stakes, make them a bit more important. This, again, I think overlaps very strongly with conversational discourse, where it moves you away from just wanting to talk about language or show language, and rather you're actually talking about using language to do something. So it could be solving a problem, it could be discussing an issue to actually make something and work together to make something, or narrate a story, for example. But really at the crux of this, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create some kind of immersive context that will get students to use language without necessarily remembering that they're doing this task. They're so involved. And then we might also think about things like our interaction patterns. So how are we bringing all of our students together? Are we varying our interactional patterns, and are we exploiting them in order to facilitate this kind of idea of near-peer interaction, where peers maybe can learn from one another by acknowledging that they have different things that they can offer one another? This could be linguistic, but this could also be in terms of learning strategies. It could be in a range of different contexts applied. And this has been shown to kind of increase motivation for speaking among learners, because it gives them some demonstration that they could also become strong, proficient speakers. And the whole premise of the Nearpeer role model is to have somebody who's like you, who can be a bit of a role model for you, because if they could do it, then so could I. So the idea really being to have a very realistic model. And so with these areas of language pedagogy, we've got lots of different things to consider. A range of different approaches that are both, I think, contextual and procedural. So how can we bring this into our curricula in terms of thinking about time for speaking? How can we implement this in our classes? What kind of approaches will we take? Will it be about learner-centered? Will it be about immersive tasks? Well, we have to think about our interactional patterns. And then with that, we also want to look to try and reflect authentic language, right? So we want to be able to reflect authentic language and include perhaps elements from this corpus linguistic perspective. So how do people actually use language in our teaching of conversation? We might want to create this space for interthinking. So we want to have in our kind of overall plan that the tasks for conversation allow for this interthinking or this co-construction of knowledge. So we're allowing students to work effectively and collaborate well together. And then we might also want to think about learning as not just a social act, but also think about learning as a cognitive act. And this might involve, quite simply, encouraging things like reflection and self-evaluation so that students can take more stock of their own learning and try to evaluate their own learning so that they can become a little bit more autonomous. And so all of this then coming together is us trying to draw on research from language pedagogy, from psycholinguistics and motivation, from corpus linguistics and conversation analysis, all of that together in order to help us think about how to effectively teach and develop conversation skills. And then I think in the current climate, what we need to do then is think about how can we move towards virtual contexts with all of this information? How do we bring all of this approach into a virtual context? One thing we could do is we could look at the literature. So what do we know about digital pedagogy? So we know that students in blended contexts tend to outperform those who are working maybe in just online or just face-to-face contexts. And this is often to do with students having a more flexible approach to learning, having more time to consolidate more some elements of learning, and then having classroom spaces for achieving other ends. So this kind of mixed approach. I don't know if this is your own experience. It'd be interesting to see what you think. But research has shown that there's more participation online. In my own experience, that is the case. I found that if I'm asking students for some input, I might get one or two students to respond to me in class openly. But if I use something like Menti or some kind of interactive presentation software, I end up getting 20 answers from students. And it helps me kind of see in a much kind of more broad sense what my students know, and not just what the strongest one knows or what the most confident one knows. So I find that quite true in my context, that there's more participation online in general, in terms of interaction at least. The internet and online kind of digital pedagogies allow for more authentic and autonomous learning. So the idea being that there's more content, authentic content available at our fingertips, but again, that doesn't come without issues. And that it helps develop learner autonomy, because learners often have to work in their own way and in their own context. And this is an opportunity for us to develop that autonomy, although it's not something that just happens, right? So we need to actively endeavor to make that difference. Online learning often allows for things like exploratory learning and ubiquitous learning. This largely meaning that through the likes of the internet, we can kind of delve through things and get lost in things and move from page to page in order to be able to get a lot more information. And ubiquitous learning meaning that can happen at any time all around us. So we can learn quite a lot in that sense. In online contexts, the choice has been found to be quite important. So this is the idea that going back to learner-centered content and personalization, that learners' choice is very motivating. And this is often linked to the idea that the internet is full of so much content, and that it's very easy for them to be able to access things that interest them. So why not? Why can't they use things that interest them? There's a kind of provisional research that shows that augmented reality is very effective at helping us develop things like vocabulary learning. And so this is the idea that using augmented reality allows you to show the words, but perhaps some movements, some images to kind of scaffold the teaching of that vocabulary. This also has implications for things like multisensory approaches to teaching, which are very effective in STEM contexts. So we're seeing some kind of emergence of technologies being useful in those different ways. Access is the big one. So also this might be a positive or a negative depending on how you think about it, that there's a lot more kind of instant expectation in terms of content, in terms of teaching and learning, and students can access their using mobiles to learning on the go. Often this means that we need to think about things like bite-sized learning and how we kind of package all of that together. And then Curry's talked about these ideas of personalized and adaptive technologies. I think these are quite controversial in that they have mitigated kind of degrees of success, and the idea being that they should stream to you personalized, needs-based content. But I think this is still quite a challenge for the industry to deliver. And also something that might not necessarily capture everything depending on what we consider to be the needs. But anyway, I think what we can take from this is that there is some interesting research that could guide us on the development of our digital pedagogies. However, it's a little bit overwhelming, and I don't know if you've noticed so far, I haven't actually given you a tool to say you should use this tool to teach conversation, because there are so many different resources out there that we could use. And it's very difficult sometimes to be able to know what it is that we should do. And I found that, I often return to this quote from Selwyn about digital pedagogy, in that digital pedagogies will not automatically improve your teaching. Using technology is not automatically going to make everything better. And using more and more technologies that we see every other day, they're not going to necessarily improve our online pedagogies. What we need to do is make sure that there's a good fit between what we want to do and the technology that we're going to use to do it. And for me, this quite simply always comes back to focusing on the pedagogy. What are we trying to achieve here? What's our teaching approach? What's our aim? And then how do we do that? How do we execute that in an online context? And so I would step back from the myriad digital tools that are available, and I would ask myself some questions. And so I might think about what kind of technologies I want to use, how I want to use them. These questions could be things like, how can we expose learners to good conversation models? And can technology and online learning help? And if so, how? Or we might ask, how can we make time for conversations in our online classes? Can technology and online learning help? And if so, how? We might say, how can we create immersive, collaborative, and learner-centered conversation tasks? And I think you're going to see the pattern here. Can technology and online learning help? If so, how? How can we facilitate interthinking and co-construction among our learners? And again, can technology and online learning help? And if so, how? And finally, how could we facilitate metacognitive approaches to consolidating this type of learning? And again, can technology and online learning help, and how? And so with these questions, what I try to do is I try to list out my aims or my needs. What I want to do is I want to try and create learning opportunities for learners that allow me to make time for conversation, to include good models, perhaps, to create immersive and collaborative tasks, to allow for this idea of interthinking and co-construction, and to also allow for some metacognitive strategies in order to help consolidate learning. And I would like to do it using technology, but I don't want to be led by the technology. I want to be led by my pedagogical aims. And so I kind of want to walk you through a sample task that I came up with, and I think you could modify this depending on your context in terms of the complexity. So we're going to put it into practice. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to develop a conversation using an immersive online task. So I wanted to see how could I do that. And so what I thought of was I thought that I would identify some kind of global issue that interests my students and identify a number of YouTube videos on the topic to share with them. So this would be perhaps something like climate change, for example. Think about things that in terms of, I would talk with my students, find out what it is that they're interested in, and then identify some content that I could use to share with them. And what I would do is I would ask the students to watch this at home so that they could do this in their own time. This doesn't need to be something that they do in class. And I often find with videos, I'd rather kind of do some video work asynchronously, because it allows students to rewatch as many times as they need and kind of get as much out of it as they need in the moment. Sometimes students prefer to kind of rewatch things. So get them to watch it for homework, and I'd give them some kind of broad task for their homework watching. There's not particular questions that they need to answer. Rather, I would just get them to make sure they understand it, write down a summary of what it is that these videos talked about, these particular kind of global issue of perhaps climate change. But it doesn't necessarily need to be that. If you're working in a younger context, perhaps you don't necessarily want to give them something on climate change, but you could ask them to, you know, watch an excerpt from a show that they really like, and then write about why they really like a certain character, perhaps. So we can kind of change out these, that's why I've kind of left it pretty generic, in that you might be able to figure out a way to meld it to your own context. When we come into online class, what I would do is I'd break the students into breakout rooms in pairs or in groups of 3. So probably most likely I'd like to do it in groups of 3. And so what I would do in this situation is I would just put my students into these breakout rooms and ask them to complete the following kind of task. For this global issue, what I'd like them to do is try and come up with a solution. And what they need to do is they need to talk about this together. So they need to have a conversation. The idea here is that they're in their breakout rooms in groups of 3, effectively trying to solve climate change. And this allows them to engage in conversations and work together in order to come up with some kind of solution, which I think we mentioned earlier in this idea of immersive tasks. And I think quite importantly, what I would do at this point as well is I'd get the students to record their conversations. So I want them to capture these conversations and keep them for themselves, so they're going to look at later. After that, I might bring the students back to class, and for each group, I'd ask them to share their proposed solution for this massive global problem. What did they come up with in their conversations, and maybe I'd ask them to have prepared something small, like a small outline, perhaps like a one slide presentation or some graphics that they could use to try and illustrate their argument in some way, or support their kind of conclusions that they've come to in some way. And then I might get the students to vote on the best solution, or perhaps there could be multiple votes. You could vote on the best solution. You could vote on maybe the most feasible solution, the most pragmatic solution, the most outrageous solution, whatever it is you think would work, and have as many of these kinds of solutions as you think. Or these kind of votes as you think. And you could use a polling feature for something like this. So get them to use a particular polling feature. And then for homework, and this is quite an important step, what I would get them to do is I'd get them to listen back to their recording, and I get them to ask themselves questions based on the recording. And this would all be kind of part of their overall kind of learning portfolio, their overall development as a language learner. And so I might get them to do things like note down how many words that they use that they learned the previous week. This would be, for example, words related to climate change, if that's what it is that I taught them in class, allowing them to kind of identify that they're using things they've learned recently. I might get them to focus on a particular language feature that they think is important. So if this could bring us back to this conversation level, try and listen out for how you open and close your turns. What are you doing when you open and close your turns? How are you asking and answering questions? How are you showing disagreement? So getting them to think a little bit about this. I'd also might get them to reflect on any breakdowns in communication. What went wrong? How could it be improved? What kind of language could you use to fix that in some way? And so this is really getting them to look back at their own language. And so this kind of eighth step task is really looking at trying to develop conversation skills in this immersive task using kind of the features of online contexts. And so what I wanted to do was I wanted to take this task and I wanted to maybe unpack it a little bit to show you my thinking behind it in terms of trying to reflect these different ideas coming from the literature on language pedagogy, on psycholinguistics, in corpus and conversation analysis. So if we think about step 1 and step 2, this is all about getting students to look at particular YouTube videos on a particular subject that interests them. And so the thinking behind this is that it's a way of creating a personalized task and a learner-centered task. So you've asked them what they want to watch, and then that's what their focus is. In step 3 then, we're talking about getting the students to come to class, and we put them into breakout rooms. So in step 3, what we're looking at is the idea of using near-peer role models. So how are we strategically grouping these students together? We're going to put students together who can support one another, students who have experience of doing this type of thing before, and who can help kind of scaffold one another through the process. We also might think about giving different roles to the students when they move into this task. So perhaps one student will kind of be a note taker and a listener, while the other students are conversing, and they might switch up every now and again. And this gives them the opportunity to develop listening skills, speaking skills, and also observe what's happening in a live conversation. We might give them also some criteria. So how are they effectively asking questions? Are they effectively showing that they're listening? Are they effectively, signaling their agreement or disagreement? And also, this is an effective use of technology in that I wanted to create a space where students could work in a group of 3 only, without being distracted by other people, without feeling inhibited that they're speaking publicly, and giving them time to support one another. And that's what I wanted to achieve. And a breakout room helped me to achieve that. And so it was an effective use of technology in that I wasn't trying to use the breakout room. I used it because I needed it. In step 4 then, that's where I ask them to solve the problem, right? So that's where I say solve climate change. So obviously more than they could probably do. But the idea here is that it's a very immersive task. It's creating time for speaking in this lesson, because their entire task is about through conversation practices, changing their speaking patterns, and in kind of engaging in this kind of conversation. It also reflects this idea of a safe space for speaking, in that the students have this private breakout space where they're not being watched. They have an opportunity to practice and kind of get their ideas out, and they can support one another through that. It's a very collaborative task, and in that nature of collaboration and trying to solve this problem, it's inherently about interthinking. And so the students are learning together and constructing ideas together through this conversation. In step number 5, then, I'm talking about getting the students to record their presentation. And so really what I want to do with this task is I would like them to be able to look at it later. I'd like them to be able to document their learning so that they can interrogate what they did with language. And actually what they have is real linguistic evidence. You know, they're being like researchers. They're analyzing their own language in order to see what they're doing and how they could improve it. And so this reflects this idea of an effective use of technology, because ideally what I want them to do is have this documentation, and recording lets that happen. In step 6, then, I'm going to bring them back to class, and I'm going to ask them to present. And so this, again, reflecting this idea of an effective use of technology. And what I need is a tool that allows my students to present some information, for them to speak to the whole group. So I need something like a web conferencing software. And also in terms of a safe space, the students will have had plenty of time to come up with these ideas and to support one another before they have to speak openly in front of everyone. So we've kind of scaffolded their practices in terms of speaking. In step 7, then, we're talking about getting them to vote. And from the outset, raising students' awareness that, you know, there's some kind of competition element here. It raises the stakes, makes it a bit more engaging, in a sense, almost gamifies it, because there might be a winner of this. And again, what I want then is I want some kind of technology that facilitates this, this kind of ranking or effective use of technology, or rather ranking or voting or something like that, polling. So we can there's plenty of technologies that allow for that. But again, I'm not using them just because I want to, I'm using them because they serve this kind of pedagogical end. And then for step 8, where I get them to listen back to their recordings, this is really about metacognitive strategy development. I'm thinking about their reflections, I'm thinking about their self-evaluations, and getting them to determine, what they did well, what they could have done better, and how that could have been done better. This also reflects ideas like noticing hypothesis, so Schmidt's noticing hypothesis, that I'm getting them to identify discrete linguistic items that they're using to achieve certain ends, or whether or not they're not using them. Getting them to plan moving forward. And again, this is an effective use of technology in terms of being able to record this conversation and play it back. And so with all of this, the idea being that when we want to bring conversation into this online space and develop conversation skills, there's quite a lot of different items that we need to be able to bring together. So, because I've spoken quite a bit, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit now. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you to complete a little Menti poll. So I'll just get my Menti up. It's going to be menti.com, and the number is 887844. And actually, this is just really an opportunity for you to share a reflection on how you can take at least one insight from today into your practice going forward. And then we might be able to capture that up on the screen. So I'll share the screen here. So what I'd like you to do is just take a moment, go to menti.com, numbers are 887844. You take a moment to share some reflections on this idea of merging these areas of research into teaching conversation online. And is there anything that you could take into your practice going forward? And you can write as much as you like, it can be a little paragraph even. So we're seeing lots of different kind of things coming in here, and the idea of using tech when it has a purpose, making it engaging, making it productive, challenging, and so on. Getting students to record themselves and self-evaluate, brilliant. And actually this exact practice here is effectively what I do sometimes with my learners. I ask them to write little reflections using Menti and getting them to kind of capture that. And you can see that it's a really great tool for being able to kind of signal a particularly useful example of whatever kind of item we're reflecting on. And so we can see lots of really great ideas coming in through here. And really what this is about then is giving ourselves a moment at the end of all of these events as well, is to take a moment and figure out, what could I do with this? How will I take this forward? I'm just going to go back to my presentation now, but feel free to keep sharing. So in terms of summaries and reflections, from my perspective, what I wanted to do in this short talk was I wanted to talk about how we could merge fields to inform a complex practice. And I think with this presentation, what I've shown is that conversations are quite complex, right? There's quite a lot going on in conversations, and there's lots of different ways we can get information about them. We can talk about language, we can talk about using conversation analysis, using corpus linguistics to help us understand what happens in a conversation. We can talk about teaching. We can think about theories of social approaches to teaching. We can think about cognitive approaches to teaching, and then also think about those in a learning context as well. How do we facilitate that learning, and how do we perform that teaching? What do we do in the class? And then we can think about the medium. So how do we make that happen in an online context? And what do we need to do in order to make that come to, achieve the ends that we're trying to achieve? And so that's, I think, in general, the kind of story I wanted to bring together today on this idea of developing conversation skills for virtual contexts. So I have some references here, and we'll share this with you after, and you can, a lot of those papers, like I said, are freely available, and you can also get in touch with me if you have any questions about anything. So thanks, everyone.
That was fabulous, Niall. Thank you so much.
No
lots of appreciative comments in the chat. And lots of questions as well. So I'm going to try and pose a few of those to you now. I don't have time for all the questions, so if I don't ask your question, I'm very sorry. But here we go. Lots of questions now about shy students and how can you get your shy students to speak?
I think it's a really good question. what we see typically, I think, in research on online learning and digital learning is that it does actually support shy students, because often they might hide away in a class. But you're totally right in thinking that it doesn't naturally just happen, right? We need to be instrumental really in making that happen. And so I'll kind of take you back to this idea of near peer role models. And the idea here could be to think about particular students who, who have been perhaps more reserved in the past and who've come out of their shell and who are a little bit more communicative now, and maybe pair them with another student who is currently a bit more reserved. And I think a lot of the stuff that we want to do in language teaching, we try to make it happen behind the scenes. We position this person here and we put that person there. We try to make them talk to one another about a particular thing. But we can also be a bit more explicit about it as well. So we can say, if you're having particularly, a particularly difficult time speaking in public and you're not really sure how to solve it, why not ask your friend, your peer, how they solve it? And that can be a really nice way of them being able to share their experience. And this has so many advantages in that it helps them feel a little bit more human and that they know that somebody else has experienced the same thing, but it also gives them evidence that they can pass it. You know what I mean? They can surpass this problem because their friend has already done that. And so it's giving them evidence that someone like them can become a bit more communicative. Does that make sense? Does that help address that question?
Definitely. I think it's so powerful when you have students in the classroom or one student giving advice to another student.
Yes.
For some reason, they seem to listen so much more than when the teacher gives that advice.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
But we've got lots more on this idea of near-peer role models on our blog. If you go to cambridge.org/ELT/blog, loads of posts up there about near-peer role models if you want to find out more. Lots of people asking about the references, and Niall had all the references for his talk at the end of the session there, which will be sent to you. You'll have a link to the recording sent to you tomorrow. My colleague Eve is putting the link to download certificates in the chat right now, and that's also going to be sent to you. But Niall, let me move on to ask you a couple more questions. A few people asking about presentation skills and how useful you think presentation skills are in the context of developing the conversational skills that you've talked about in this session. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. I mean, I think we can develop presentation skills quite effectively in online contexts as well. And I think in any kind of experience that we have, we should look at ways that we can transfer how we approach solving a particular problem, or how we approached speaking in a particular way, and bring that into, and really I think that it's less about presentation skills and more about reflection. So if we're finding it easier for our students to develop these kind of presentational skills because they feel a bit more comfortable with it, try and get them to unpack a little bit about what is it that works well for them. And then push them that little bit further and say, how can I use that to make me better at conversations, better at this kind of spontaneous speaking? And I think that could be quite helpful in terms of giving them their own strategy. And again, developing this kind of autonomous learning approach as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think often we don't encourage students to reflect on speaking enough, maybe because it's so difficult to do. When you speak, the words disappear and then they're gone.
Yeah.
And that's where recording can be really useful. If you can record your students, then they have something then to listen back to and reflect on. Last question, because we are a little bit short of time, but you mentioned, Niall, how online learning can actually boost participation, because you're not just having a dialogue with the most confident students in the class, with the loudest students, but you get a lot more participation from others that might not speak out in other situations. And you mentioned Menti for that. I wonder if you've got any other tools that you use in your online teaching to encourage students to interact and participate. Yeah,
I mean, I guess it depends on your VLE. So I think when I'm trying to kind of get them to post things up, I often use Menti. But from asynchronous perspectives as well, you can use things like blog posts. And there's some really interesting research on getting students to write like short blog entries, and how it's really, really effective at creating this kind of online writing community among the learners. So if we wanted them to be able to improve their writing whilst also coming together a little bit more closely, whilst they're all quite spread far apart, and we want to facilitate this kind of learning community, using things like posts, like blog posts and fora are quite effective as well. And so I think, yeah, coming back to that kind of that point I made about what do I want to achieve? If I were in the ideal context, I would really like my students to be able to kind of contribute writing, support one another, respond to one another. Then I think, okay, what technology will help me do that? And so it could be blogs, it could be fora, etc.
I think that's a great point and a great place to stop. Thank you so much, Niall.
No problem. Thanks, Niall. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you to everyone who's attended, not just this session, but all the sessions in this Cambridge at Home experience. That brings us to an end, this 3-day event. But do stick with us. Keep it Cambridge for your professional development and learning needs. Remember to follow us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and take a look at the blog, cambridge.org/ELT/blog, for lots more on this topic and others. You'll be getting an email with links to